Okay, part three of psychedelic drugs. All right, moving forward, we do a little more modern history, a history that I think is pretty fun about psychedelics and how it kind of really entrenched itself in culture, not only the 60s, but really the art, the insights, the problems, and social chaos induced by, or at least inspired by, some of the psychedelic drugs really has affected us until today. And so this is just a little collection of some of um, well, you've probably heard of a lot of these bands: Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Cream. They're all these. The poster art and the album art often was inspired by psychedelics. So we'll talk about modern psychedelic history, but we can't start without talking about the invention of LSD. I already started talking about that a bit, so I'm just going to mention briefly some of the notables here, the people who really started the modern development of psychedelic drugs, and also maybe some of the more notorious that did the popularization of psychedelic drugs. All right. So Albert Hoffman, who I did mention before, is the inventor of LSD. He was working at Sandoz Laboratories and was able to extract uh, the core components of LSD um, from this fungus, this really nasty fungus. And he also discovered the active ingredients of the psilocybin mushrooms. And so that's him over there holding up an LSD molecule. And he did that back in 1943, as I told you a little bit about last time. Now, as far as popularizing or really engaging the public interest in psychedelic drugs, key was Robert Wasson. So this guy was a banker, and he wrote an article in Life magazine in the 50s that really inspired a lot of people to investigate or want to learn more about psychedelic drugs. And then we have Timothy Leary, who helped popularize LSD. He was actually a PhD and a professor at Harvard for a little while. But he maybe went a little over the deep end and was pretty much over promoting LSD without any type of real controls, and also did some pretty like loose experiments. And then you have another notable, Alexander Shulgin. He worked for some big pharma and chemical companies, making some very profitable chemicals. But when he decided he wanted to, he went ahead and started creating designer psychoactive drugs and tested most of them, I guess, on himself. But he really developed hundreds of psychoactive compounds. So here are some of the notables in psychedelic drug development, and in the case of Leary, promotion or some of the problems associated with it. So going back to Albert Hoffman at Sandoz Laboratory, he was in Basel, Switzerland, and he was particularly trying to help Sandoz develop a drug that would improve circulation. He was working off a particular fungus because he was thinking this fungus, by the way, had tons of interesting compounds in it. And so he was picking apart all the chemical compounds in this fungus and identified some that might have effects on the circulatory system. One that might have captured his eye was this lysergic acid component, because the LSD and the ergot fungus is known to produce a horrible ailment, a horrible illness in humans called St. Anthony's fire, where it causes excruciating pain in all the limbs. It feels like your body's on fire, and ultimately causes gangrene and makes you lose your limbs due to loss of circulation. And it's because you might have mistakenly eaten this particular fungus on some wheat. And in fact, there are a lot of historical incidences where armies and cities have been decimated by the mistaken eating of wheat that has this fungus on it. And there's a picture here to the right of someone who drew some of the victims of St. Anthony's fire. So yeah, not a great thing. But the fungus itself has many interesting compounds, and it apparently does have effects on the circulatory system. But he was trying to find a way to improve the circulatory system, and then figured out that this LSD-25 compound he was going to initially look at to see if it helped. It didn't, so he decided, oh well, not useful. I'll put it on the shelf. And didn't think about it again until about 5 years later. And then he took it off, decided to reinvestigate the chemical, got some accidentally on his, I don't know if he got it on his skin or he ingested it somehow, but he got it into his body. And then something happened. So he absorbed some of the stuff and he left the lab as he told his technicians and people there that he just did not feel right. And then he took a bike ride home and he asked his assistant to come with him so he would stay on his bike. And then some very weird things happened. And the quote over here in the bottom right, little by little, I could begin to enjoy the unprecedented colors and plays of shapes that persisted behind my closed eyes. Kaleidoscopic, fantastic images surged in on me, alternating, variegated, opening and then closing themselves in circles and spirals, exploding in colored fountains, rearranging and hybridizing themselves in constant flux. A pretty wonderful description of his experience and what many people experience if they take LSD. And then he did it again intentionally a couple days later, and it took a very high dose, by the way. He didn't know it at the time, but it was a very high dose, and had this very similar experience and figured, hey, this thing has potential use. It might be useful for treating psychological illnesses or other purposes, but he definitely knew it was powerful. And he wanted to make his point, so he met with the board of directors at Sandoz, all these people in suits and ties. So he had this executive board and then gave free samples essentially to everybody in the board. And they effectively tripped out and were quite impressed. And so LSD production really became a major focus of Sandoz Laboratories. Um, and so that made them a fair amount of money. And we'll talk about their clients. A lot of medical professionals, but also the CIA were major clients of Sandoz during that time. All right. So just as a note, when Hoffman took the dose, the one he took on the next day, on this day, he took 250 micrograms total. He was a scientist, so luckily he recorded everything he did. But what's interesting is that the usual dose is between 25 and 100 micrograms. So he really dosed himself well. Apparently, there were no major damage here because he went on to do many good things and he lived to 102 years old. So good for you, Albert. Oh, they call it, by the way, the reason I have a little picture of the bicycle on this paper tablet is because they often call the April 16th Bicycle Day, because that's the day he rode back home on his bicycle after accidentally taking a lot of LSD. Okay, now the public awareness and interest in psychedelics really wasn't there until the publication of some books and magazine articles. The first major one that piqued the interest of both the public and scientists was Aldous Huxley's publishing of The Doors of Perception back in 1954. So again, remember, this is the conservative 1950s, but people really had this latent interest in what psychedelics might be doing to the mind. So this book was basically his own accounting of his own experience of taking, what did he take? He'd mescaline. So taking mescaline from the peyote cactus. And so he took that and then wrote a very rich and detailed accounting of all the psychological effects that it had. And so, by the way, he was a good writer because you probably have read his books anyway. He's the one who wrote Brave New World. So he was very well known. He already had a very powerful following. And so that really helped pique the interest in the drug, in these mescaline and psychedelic experiences. He also comes from a pretty interesting lineage. He was the grandson of Thomas Henry Huxley, who was a zoologist, and he was what was called Darwin's bulldog. He's one of the main reasons Darwin's theory of evolution took off so powerfully, is because he was a very tireless proponent of the theory. So a lot of interesting things came out of that family. All right, moving on. Another interesting situation to the story, and the reason the public got interested in psilocybin and also overall in psychedelics was another publication, and that was just in Life magazine. So the probably most popular magazine of the time. And they did a special article written by Robert Wasson, who was a banker and mycologist, which means he studied mushrooms, who took a trip to Mexico and through his contacts there was able to connect up with some of the Native Americans there, Native North Americans, and were able to get access to the psilocybin experience in the mushrooms, and had an incredible experience by his own accounts, and described them very vividly in the Life magazine. And that really piqued the public interest, and specifically, it was actually had the effect of inspiring Timothy Leary to look more into the effects of psilocybin. And that's a picture. He did not look like this guy. He looked like that guy. All right, so that was the picture of Wasson back in the day. Okay, Leary, he deserves his own story. So yeah, he was what I call here more of a dumpster fire of history. So Timothy Leary, interesting guy, and I've read his biography. It's fascinating, a little bit disturbing, but he was a Harvard scientist. And was kicked out of Harvard for being a bit fast and loose with giving out drugs to pretty much anybody, for including his students, for doing not the best scientific controls and designing his studies very well. But he was essentially an evangelist for drugs like psilocybin. But then after he took LSD, that became his true cause. Um, so he really thought that if everybody took LSD, it would change everything. It would open up perception in the entire country. Maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong, but some of the issues that Leary had is that he didn't really consider that for some people these experiences had negative outcomes. He didn't do good science. And some of his evangelization, along with the 60s and the social upheaval, political upheaval, the Vietnam War, all of this stuff, the hippie movement, it just caused the society to get all nervous and terrified about psychedelics. Um, so he was one reason why we had Richard Nixon back in 1970 putting all the known psychedelics into Schedule 1. Other interesting asides, Timothy Leary saw the inside of 29 prisons. He ended up escaping in this crazy escape from a prison in California and went to Africa to hang out there with, I think, a rebel out there, and then eventually made it to Europe and I think back to the US. I'm not sure if he was pardoned or not, but just a crazy life experience. Yeah, Richard Nixon described him as the most dangerous man in America. Although Nixon made a lot of most dangerous people, he was essentially worried about reelection and the impact of Watergate and Vietnam, and so he wanted more enemies that he could point at. And definitely, Leary was a good one. He was unraveling the social fabric. I'm sure that was an easy cause to make. But anyway, the political backlash against Leary in the 60s in general really set back psychology and biological research into psychedelics for at least 50 years. All right. But then compounding that was MK Ultra. MK Ultra was also crazy. So MK Ultra was a secret CIA program, and there were other programs with other funny names like MK Ultra that were also funded by the CIA and other sources, to develop mind control methods and truth serums. And this is for real, and it's documented during the Cold War, from early 1950s to late 60s, and I think even into the 70s. And the reason why these programs were so well funded is because the US, we were in the middle of the Cold War, and so the US government and people were terrified that the communists were going to go ahead of us in developing these drugs. And so there was a mind control gap with the communists. This included China and Russia, or at the time USSR, the Soviet Union. All right. So this was, again, very well funded. This research was undertaken by more than 80 institutions in the US and Canada and probably other countries as well. Many of the subjects and many of these things were not by official institutions, but were done by CIA operatives. These drugs were given to and used and ingested by US and Canadian citizens and military personnel without their knowledge in many cases. And some really weird things happen. Anytime you read into the history of the CIA, you learn about some weird things that happen. The CIA actually set up brothels in San Francisco under the name Operation Midnight Climax, nice name, to observe and film men having sex with prostitutes in a one-way mirror while afterwards being asked and questioned about very personal elements of their life. And so, yeah, they had this one-way mirror. I heard stories about the CIA operatives sitting on portable toilets, drinking martinis, watching all these things happen. Why on earth were they doing that? A lot of the paperwork has been destroyed, but some of the goals, I guess, were to determine if combining drugs like LSD and sex could be used to get the Soviet spies to talk, to divulge more, or maybe convert to our side. So crazy stuff. Other crazy things that were kind of terrifying is one researcher kept 7 drug junkies, probably heroin addicts or something like that, enticed by promises of more hard drugs on LSD for 77 straight days. So these people were basically tripping on LSD for 77 days straight, and nobody really knows what ever happened to these people because no follow-up was ever done on these subjects. And other even more sinister experiences, there were people who were given the drug unwittingly, one ended up jumping out of a 13-story building. Another one ended up holding up a bar at gunpoint and losing his career. So yeah, some bad things happened. And eventually it was shut down. It took a long time though. This was active for almost 20 years, I think. Around the time when it was being deactivated, perhaps to avoid culpability and to just follow up, and during the Watergate scandal, the CIA director, Richard Helms at the time, ordered all the files of this destroyed in 1973. And so many of the records of this illegal program are gone to history, but some survived. Some people were investigated. There were reports and there were some prosecutions, but not too many. Okay, talked about history. I think it's just fascinating, but back to drugs and the brain. All right, so here are our categories again. We had our 5 categories of drugs based on how they look or behave like some of the endogenous transmitters and work on different and similar receptor systems. All right, so I'll focus on the anticholinergics and the serotonergics right now. All right, anticholinergics. We'll keep this one relatively short. You've already heard about anticholinergics, mostly in the periphery. I've already talked about drugs that block the cholinergic system because we've talked about belladonna, those drugs that can go ahead and make your pupils dilate. And so they block, in this case, is anticholinergic. So they block the muscarinic acetylcholine receptor. Scopolamine is the principal blocker of the muscarinic acetylcholine receptor. And so that's it. So if you remember, acetylcholine is the parasympathetic nervous system modulator. So if you block it, you kind of activate your sympathetic system, and so your eyes get big to see a predator or something like that. So it's the same general mechanism, but now it's acting in your brain and not just in your eyeball and your peripheral nervous system. In this case, drugs like scopolamine are causing psychedelic effects. And those psychedelic effects are delirium, where you're just disoriented, you don't know what you're seeing, you're just confused, you feel very intoxicated, you lose memory. You can't really form any memories of this experience. They're very hard. You're very drowsy, small euphoria, that might be the allure, the high fatigue, mental confusion, dreamless sleep. So unlike some of the psychedelics that can induce florid dreams, you don't get much dreamy sleep. And sometimes you get this feeling of flying. And I have that picture down here, which I think is great because it summarizes one of these general ideas, which I think is fascinating, is that the whole idea of witches flying on brooms might have come from pagans or witches essentially using this drug by making a salve or an ointment with it and rubbing it on their bodies somehow. And then when it gets into their system, you can often get this feeling of flying. And so they might have had the experience of flying. There are some old reports, and this is in medieval era, so I don't know if you can trust the reports of witches doing this, so rubbing this stuff on broomsticks and then exposing their bodies to it. And I don't know, but it's an interesting story that you might have had this development of this myth of the witch on a broom from this particular drug. All right. It appears to not expand consciousness. So this is very much how it differs from some of the classic serotonergic psychedelics, where they might potentially expand your sense of self and your ego. This one actually just confuses things rather than expands. You forget most of the experience afterwards too. All right, what drugs are like this? Another drug I've talked about a number of times already, the sacred datura or Jimson weed is an example that you again will see in Tucson in the summer. Beautiful flower. It can make you hallucinate, but it will make you violently ill. So not recommended. Okay, bunnies. Okay, that's my cue. There's a flying bunny. Just flying, flying.